Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Kroc School and to our final distinguished lecture of the year. My name is Andrew Blum. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Executive Director of the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice here at the Kroc School of Peace Studies. And I'd like to thank you for coming out to join us tonight for what will be a really interesting evening, I'm sure. We're proud to call the Kroc School the global hub for peace building and social innovation. And we're really honored today to be welcoming a renowned social innovator and a social innovator that works on building a more peaceful society, a society free of violence and hate. In our last distinguished lecture we had in this theater, Dr. Barbara F. Walter talked about the threat of civil war in the United States. And at the end of that lecture, she pointed to social media and other online environments as one of the key risk factors that was driving potential violence in the United States. Our speaker tonight, Vidhya Ramalingam, is a world-renowned leader on how to address hate and violence in online environments and how to reduce the ability of online environments to drive violence offline. I am so looking forward to her talk tonight because it's such a timely talk. We're moving closer to the election in November, and unfortunately we know that the election in the US may drive hate, may drive violence. But also, we see new and sometimes dangerous tools coming online in our online environments every day. And so to address hate and violence in our society, we have no choice but to address them in our online environments as well. Before I more formally introduce Vidhya, I want to say I'm also really excited that once again we'll welcome one of our Kroc School students onto the stage today for the Q&A portion of our program. Carol Komen is one of our students in our Masters of Social Innovation program and a practice fellow in the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice. She's worked with social enterprises in the tech industry that leverage technology to empower women and youth with digital skills and to enable them to access income opportunities in the digital economy. So a great student to have on our stage tonight to talk with Vidhya. If you would like to ask a question for our Q&A, you can go to slido.com, slido.com, and enter code 1077547, and we'll put that up on the slides as we get closer to our Q&A as well. So that's code 1077547, and I'll have those questions up on stage when I come out for the Q&A. So without further ado, Vidhya Ramalingam is founder and CEO of Moonshot, a company working to end online harms, applying evidence, ethics, and human rights. Under her leadership, Moonshot has pioneered online intervention programs to pull individuals out of violent movements and new partnerships with tech companies to safeguard against hate. Moonshot has twice been named to Fast Company's prestigious annual list of world's most innovative companies. She is also recognized internationally for her role leading policy responses to domestic terrorism, including consulting with the governments of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and the Netherlands. She regularly advises big tech and heads of state on tackling terrorism online, including recently the prime ministers of New Zealand and Norway. She regularly testifies before the US Congress and Canadian Parliament on the global threat posed by white supremacist terrorism. And she serves on the board of Life After Hate, an organization set up by former white supremacists to help individuals leave hate groups. So please, please enjoy Vidhya's talk tonight and help me welcome her on our stage.
Thank you so much for having me today and to join you all for this distinguished lecture series. It's such an honor to be invited. My name is Vidhya Ramalingam, and I am founder and CEO of Moonshot. And I have spent the last 15 years of my life focused on the prevention of white supremacist extremism and terrorism. And I want to start by saying we are living in an era of unprecedented hate online. For white supremacists in particular, their ideology is premised on the notion that a race war is coming. And typically, crises are moments where we typically see these actors grasping to take fear and anxiety in society and to turn that into an opportunity for them to grow and to break down society as we know it. Over the past few years, we have faced multiple crises as a nation and as a global community. The most obvious crisis was, of course, the onset of the global pandemic 4 years ago. I can't believe that's been 4 years now. We all found ourselves online more, and as a global community, we were all doing more online shopping. We were also on Zoom more. As we were doing that, hate actors were also engaging with hate content at a higher level than ever before. Just at the start of the pandemic, the first month after the start of the pandemic in the United States, we tracked a 37% increase in attempts to access hate content. And within 1 year, by April 2021, that number had risen to 140% higher engagement with hate content across the United States. This is just one example of a crisis that was exploited by extremists. And there have been countless more crises. The murder of George Floyd in 2020, the 2020 election, the insurrection on the US Capitol in 2021, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022 and the prolonged war that followed, the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack on Israel, and the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. We have been in a period of prolonged crisis as a global community, as a nation, and extremist actors have taken advantage of every moment to exploit fear and anxiety. Now, today, I'm going to talk through some of the data that we use to understand the scale of extremism and hate online. But I want to be really clear. This is not going to be a talk where we're going to collectively despair about the state of hate online. Despite all of this, I am profoundly optimistic about the future. And that might be a coping mechanism, given the work I do. You can tell me after the talk. But my optimism isn't based on a hope and a dream. It's based on real emerging evidence to show that change is possible. I want to start by saying I founded Moonshot, which is an organization that develops technology, but I am not a technologist by training. I am not a software engineer. My journey into this started 15 years ago when I decided that I wanted to meet with white supremacists. I wanted to understand how it was that someone could go down the path where they would believe that someone who looked like me and like my family shouldn't exist or shouldn't have the rights that they do. I had trained as an anthropologist, and I thought, can I, as a person of color, conduct ethnographic research with a group of white nationalists? Is that possible? Most of my professors at the time laughed me out of the room and told me it wasn't possible. But there was one, my supervisor, the late Professor Marcus Banks, who was an incredible anthropologist at Oxford. He encouraged me. And he asked me the right questions to ensure that I could do my fieldwork safely. He offered support and access to training and prepared me for what would ultimately be the most transformative experience in my career and certainly at the time as a researcher. I spent 2 years conducting an ethnographic research project with a group of white nationalists. It was the most challenging experience of my life, and as you can tell, I was not there undercover. I started by simply attending their public rallies and their events. I would stand at the back, just show up. And once I built the courage, it took a few times for me to build the courage. Once I built up the courage, I started to go up and just ask them questions about who they were, why they were there. There were, of course, a lot of people who wouldn't speak to me at all, wouldn't even look at me when I asked them questions. There were some people who said not very nice things to me. But over time, their curiosity grew. I was the odd Indian woman who kept turning up to their rallies, and at some point, I had people coming up to me and asking, "Why are you here? Why do you keep coming?" So their confusion and their curiosity about me actually opened up doors and helped me to start to have conversations with them. So I went from attending rallies with them to being invited into their homes. I met their wives, I met their children, I attended their meetings, I attended their social events, I did life history interviews with dozens of people in the movement. It was a very, very strange experience and a very difficult experience, not least as a woman of color doing that work, but as I mentioned earlier, it was transformative for me. I learned a lot about hate movements, but perhaps more important than learning about movements was understanding that movements were made up of people, human beings. They were oftentimes rational. I think I went into this thinking these people are monsters. I'm never going to be able to understand them. And I was surprised that I found people in the movement who were rational. They had human emotions. They had fears. I even recognized and could possibly even get myself to understand how someone who had experienced what they had in their lives might find themselves feeling the way they felt. They had real stories that had led them into these movements, and I started to understand what it might take to get them to change their paths. So my career has always been based on the fundamental principle that change is possible, even for those who we might think are too far gone. And this isn't a theory, it's not a hypothesis. I have seen the evidence firsthand, and since delivering that research 15 years ago, I've worked with hundreds of people who have left hate movements. These are people who were embedded in hate movements, who have now turned their lives around. For years, I served as a board member for an organization called Life After Hate. It's an organization that supports individuals to leave neo-Nazi movements here in the US. And I saw them support hundreds of people and their families to make this change. But what has changed in the past 15 years? In 2011, a bomb went off in Oslo, Norway, at government buildings. And then a white supremacist terrorist went on to carry out a horrific attack on the island of Utøya. 77 people were killed, largely children, young people who were at a youth political camp. It was such a horrific tragedy. That moment propelled white supremacy from being seen as a community safety issue, something to be dealt with locally, to a prime national security issue, at least in Europe, where I worked at the time. When the European Union launched its first intergovernmental initiative to build capacity across the EU to prevent that form of terrorism, I was tasked with leading this initiative. I spent 4 years visiting every country in the EU to build evidence on what worked in prevention at the local level. And I spent time with organizations that were physically pulling people out of neo-Nazi movements, organizations that had been operating since the 80s and the 90s with proven methodologies to change people's lives. But that attack wasn't the only one. There was Charleston, Pittsburgh, Christchurch, El Paso, Poway, Halle, Buffalo, the list goes on. And as these attacks hit global communities and the United States repeatedly, year after year, the US counterterrorism community started to recognize that this form of terrorism was posing a major threat to US national security. Countless lives lost for us to get there. I remember in April 2019, I was asked to testify before Congress on the global threat posed by white supremacist terrorism. This was just weeks after the horrific attack that took place against 2 mosques in New Zealand. It was the first hearing by the House Committee on Foreign Affairs with a witness focused on white supremacist terrorism. Today, The FBI Director and Secretary of Homeland Security alike have stated that domestic extremists, which is a term that encompasses white supremacists, it encompasses racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, as well as many other categories, domestic extremists pose the greatest threat to the homeland. What else has changed in the last 15 years? Well, social media has transformed absolutely everything. Today, people are posting, engaging, accessing hate content at an alarming rate. And social media and online platforms are so often presented as spaces where we see the worst of humanity in action. Now, across industry, tech companies are improving their efforts to moderate and remove terrorist content. That has been significantly helped by recent regulation and legislation, like the EU Digital Services Act. Legislation and regulation does make a difference. But those moderation efforts are not enough to stem violent extremism on its own, and this is for 3 reasons. Number 1, the vast majority of hate content may not be eligible for removal under the community standards and policies of the tech companies themselves, large and small, even for regulators. And the reason why this is the case is because people who post this content intentionally walk the line. They know how to write their hate in ways that will keep it on the platform, that evade those moderation policies, and they do that incredibly well. Number 2, there are still many spaces on the internet which are not liable to takedowns at all. And you might immediately be thinking about fringe platforms, 4chan, 8kun, those sorts of platforms, but also think about emails and direct messages, and even search bars. This is the example I like to give here. You can enter anything you'd like into a search bar. Yes, the results might be affected by the algorithms, but search bars themselves are a place where people express themselves online. And finally, number 3, when a post, a video, or a comment is deleted, the post is deleted, but not the person that posted it. That person still exists in our communities and may go on to post hateful content on other platforms or may continue to pose a threat to the community around them. So if we are going to stem the flow of hate online, we have to get at the people behind those data points. And online platforms actually present an incredible opportunity to reach people that are perpetrating harm and to try and get them to change their paths. So in 2015, I founded Moonshot. Moonshot delivers methodologies to end online violence. And the work that we do aims to get behind the data points and get at the human beings who ultimately exploit these platforms for these horrific purposes. We are a team of 70 spread across 3 offices. Our US headquarters is in Washington, DC, and we have offices in London, Dublin, and soon to be Toronto. Our team includes engineers, data scientists, clinical psychologists, marketing experts. It's a real range of skills that we need in order to get at this problem online. Step 1 for us is understanding the scale and spread of violence online. Now, we are in a moment of heightened risk. October 7th completely shifted the baseline for threats of violence online across the US. We track threats of violence against 2,100 targets across the United States as part of our work for federal and state governments. And you can see a breakdown here of some of the recent data from February. The red bar shows February's data, and the gray bar is the baseline from the prior 6 months. Prior to October 7th, on any given month, we were tracking approximately 25,000 threats of violence online in domestic violent extremist communities, against all communities, Jewish communities, Black communities, Asian American communities, Muslim communities, the list goes on. So prior to October 7th, approximately any given month, 25,000 threats of violence online. That skyrocketed the month after October 7th to over 50,000 threats of violence per month in the immediate months afterwards. We saw over a 400% increase in threats of violence against Jewish communities, the same against Muslim communities in October of 2023. This has been lowering month on month, and we're now seeing threats against these communities at around 80% higher than prior to October 7th, but it still remains very high, and there's a question for me as to whether we will ever return back to the normal baseline, and that feels like a terrible thing to say, but the normal baseline of threats of violence across the United States online. This is also the year that we are likely to see extremist use of AI start to have real-world harmful effects. We are already seeing this now with the release of tools like Gab.ai, a tool that was created by Gab to perpetrate harm in January of this year. And in the context of elections, threats to public officials, and really anyone outspoken on hot-button social issues, will be at a high. Furthermore, we know from initial studies, it seems pretty clear that threats of violence online do correlate with offline violence. We've run comparisons, again, as part of our work for the federal government, we've run comparisons between our threats of violence online, the data that you're seeing here, and FBI hate crime data. And in looking at the data from 2022, the 2023 data is not yet available, in looking at the data from 2022, we see an almost eerie month-by-month correlation in threats of violence against communities, and specifically when you look at threats against LGBTQ+ communities, Black communities, Jewish communities, the peaks and troughs that we see happening online are almost line for line reflected in offline violence. So let's talk about what we can do about this. I want to briefly acknowledge the evolution of online hate prevention over the last decade. We have learned so much as a community working to counter hate. One learning is particularly relevant. If we are going to reach people, the people behind the data points, it's not good enough for us to just counter the narratives online. For someone that is very far down this path, someone deeply embedded in a hateful worldview, even someone considering violence, it's not enough for us to show them a video online that challenges hate or tells them that immigration's great and that diversity is great, a video that counters the facts, as much as I know we want to do that and have a conversation about the facts. We can't show them a video like that and hope that seeing one video is going to make them question their beliefs. We need to start taking what we know works in offline violence prevention and start applying it online. We know that in offline settings, behavioral health methods work in engaging with someone who's embedded in hate. And when I say behavioral health methods, because I'm going to use that term a few times, what I mean by that is a broad range of services, including clinical services, counseling, social work, mental health services. Behavioral health methods all use these kinds of approaches to deal with the threat of violence. We know that this works now from decades of evidence from across Europe, actually. I mentioned programs that have been working since the 80s and 90s, programs supporting individuals exiting hate groups. I mentioned I spent 4 years traveling around Europe, spending time with these programs, and what I found was a huge raft of evidence from countries like Norway, Sweden, Germany, amongst others, that had successfully, over the course of decades, completely deconstructed, in some places, neo-Nazi movements, but also pulled hundreds of people out of them. And this was entirely through counseling, social work, and wraparound services. Many of these programs had been operating for 20+ years, but they had been doing so at a small scale. I actually ended up staying in residence with one of these organizations in Germany and watching firsthand the interventions that they did and the transformation of individuals as they turned their lives around. So it works. You can turn someone's life around. It just requires deeply personalized interventions, and it does require specific training. More often than not, if someone is going down a hateful path, hate is usually just the tip of the iceberg. You have to get at the underlying drivers of their worldview, and if you can do that, get at the underlying emotional drivers, the hate ideology oftentimes falls away. So, Moonshot works with behavioral health specialists across the world to bring their services online to audiences that are engaging with hate and extremist content. If we're going to try and intervene with people at risk of violent extremism, we have to meet them where they are, which is often online. We all spend our lives probably at least 30% online. For some people in the room, it might be 50. What we do is we reach out to thousands of people consuming hate content online, and we offer violence prevention services to them. Sometimes it's the chance to speak to a crisis counselor via an online chat. Sometimes it's a hotline to call. Sometimes it's a number to text anonymously. In recent studies by the US Secret Service, they found 83% of school shooters reference their intent to carry out an attack to someone. 66% of these cases did this within 2 weeks before the attack, and an awful lot of those individuals did so online. In studies of perpetrators, we often see moments where they are tentative about their beliefs, where they have doubts about their plans, where they hope that someone will stop them. These are the windows of opportunity where we need to get there first, and we need to reach out and be the person offering that help. And well before someone actually plans an attack, when they're engaging with hateful content online, when they're inciting violence online, they are telling us, and sometimes they're shouting at us, that they're at risk and that they need help. So we need to get there first. And you might ask, well, if we reach out and offer them help, are they going to take that up? Are they actually going to say yes to speaking to someone? The answer to that question is yes, and I'm going to take you through some examples and data on this. Going back 7 years ago, we ran some tests to offer self-help and psychosocial services to people who were engaging with hate content online, specifically white supremacist content. We found that they were 48% more likely to engage with offers of assistance or self-help online than when we offered the same services to the general public. And if they wanted to join a hate group like the KKK, they were actually 115% more likely to take up that offer of assistance than the general public. But in the past 6 years, we have moved from running small-scale pilots and tests to building year-on-year a clear evidence base that this works. And so today, we deliver multi-year models, mostly funded by governments, to intervene in the radicalization process online. So, how does this work? How do we do this? Ironically, the starting point to deliver interventions online has to be offline. We can't deliver behavioral health interventions online if we don't have a strong base of service providers offline who can engage with people at risk of hate and violence. Sometimes there are already organizations that are equipped specifically to deal with people who are embedded in a hateful worldview. And I mentioned to you earlier those exit programs that exist in countries like Germany, Sweden, and others. So where those organizations exist, it's certainly an option to work with them. But in the vast majority of countries which are dealing with this problem, and in the US as well, that established exit organization may not exist, or it may not have the scale to support people across the country. So in those cases, what we are looking for is organizations that fundamentally know how to engage safely with violence in any form. We have worked with organizations that mostly spend their time preventing domestic violence, gang violence, substance abuse, suicide prevention. All of these kinds of organizations absolutely have the skills and the qualifications to engage with someone at risk of hate-based violence. They may just require an additional layer of training to better understand the ideologies that they might be dealing with. So our starting point is to identify at least one organization, but ideally a small network of organizations who are service providers, who work day in, day out on violence prevention, and who have the skills and the qualifications to deal with someone who might be at risk of violence. And we give them that extra layer of training to ensure they know what to do when someone is spouting conspiracy theories or bringing up specific ideologies. And once we find those service providers, we work with them to bring their service provision online. Ironically, the pandemic has made this work so much easier because the prevalence of telehealth has just made our jobs a lot easier as we try and bring these services online. But what this might mean is developing a website for service provision, online chat functions, the creation of a hotline or a text line, the creation of video content and self-help resources. So what we do then, once we have those services online, is we need to find a way to actually reach people who are engaging with hate content. So what we do is we deliver advertisements, same methodology that Coca-Cola and Adidas use to get us to buy sneakers. We use that exact same approach online to run ads against anyone who is engaging with hate content. So somebody who's engaging with hate content sees an ad offering the chance to speak to a crisis counselor, someone who can help them. And it is their choice to take up a service. And this consent and their choice is so, so important to make this effective. And people do take up the offer. Before I get into examples, just for theory of change wonks in the audience, a quick view of our theory of change here. This explains our theory here. So you find individuals who are at risk in online spaces, you engage them, offer them services, they get into a one-to-one engagement with a counselor, a social worker, they then choose themselves to take up a service, to enroll in services, and that's where that social worker, that clinical psychologist, whoever is on the end of that line, can start to assess their risk and assess what their underlying needs are. And they can then build a program around that individual to work their way out of this hateful ideology and hateful worldview. And I want to show you some examples of what this looks like in practice. So if someone is consuming hate content online, and here are some examples of what that might look like. A Google search for how to join a hate group, a Bing search around genocide. This is a specific conspiracy theory around where individuals in hate groups believe that there is an effort to create genocide against white people, so that's what you're seeing there. Quora, which is a platform where you ask questions. People do actually ask questions like, how do I tell my parents that I'm an incel, which is a violent misogynistic movement. And then watching YouTube videos that glorify terrorism. That's the sort of content that should really be taken down, but unfortunately, as you all know, the platforms don't do a good enough job of removing that kind of content. So if you're engaging with this sort of content online, you might see an ad, and you can see some examples here on the right. It doesn't shake the finger at the person and say, hey, we think you're an extremist and you need to stop. Instead, it asks them questions about how they're feeling. It asks them questions about their emotional state. And actually, one of the most powerful questions that we have found works time and time again in almost any country we test this is, are you feeling isolated? And are you feeling lonely? This offers them the chance to speak to someone. I want to give you a few concrete examples from some of our different models in different countries, just to show you how this works. And apologies, actually, I forgot to show you what happens when they choose to take up the offer. They land on a website that offers them multiple pathways to get in touch and talk to a counselor. So, Canada. I want to give you an example from an ongoing project. It's a partnership with the Canadian government. We are offering free, confidential, and anonymous psychosocial support to internet users in Canada who are engaging with violent far-right and violent incel, so violent misogynistic content. This is a program that started in 2 provinces, Ontario and Quebec, and we are now scaling it up with the Canadian government's funding to 5 provinces. And here you see an example of what the service offering looks like to someone who is consuming hate content. Again, asking those questions and saying, we're here to support you, we're here to talk to you. Within the first 6 months this program was live, we had over 20 individuals self-refer themselves for support to intervention services. These included individuals who were consuming deeply violent content about women, individuals that were fantasizing about violence, individuals who were glorifying terrorism online. One participant said, I was looking for my favorite blog and your ad came up. Their favorite blog was a neo-Nazi website. Now that person is in ongoing engagement with a counselor, someone who can help them manage that risk. 4 of those individuals actively engaged in long-term care, and it is a long-term process to work with individuals who are embedded in hate. And I want to bring this home to the US, and I'm going to give you a couple examples here. In 2020, we launched a partnership with Crisis Text Line. This is a nationwide text message-based counseling service across the US. They offer nationwide 24/7 text messaging support, and it's offered by 3,000 volunteers nationwide. We set up a dedicated text line for Americans that were consuming hate content online. Of a sample of 200 individuals across the country who were engaging with hate content and took up this crisis counseling offer, 5 of those individuals required immediate suicide de-escalation. An additional 5 of those individuals required what we call active rescue, which is where the counselor needs to immediately liaise with the local emergency services dispatch team because they believe a life is imminently at risk. I want to put that into context for you. That is 10 individuals out of a sample of 200 people who were engaging with hate content online who required suicide de-escalation or active rescue during a counseling session. To put that into context, that is 3 times the national average for the general public, 3 times the rate at which immediate violence de-escalation services needed to be engaged. So what this shows us is people consuming hate content online in the US are at heightened risk of violence, whether against others or against themselves. And I want to give you a more recent example. 2 years ago, a horrific white supremacist attack took place in Buffalo, New York. 10 people, all Black, were killed at a grocery store in Buffalo, New York at the hands of a white supremacist, someone who largely radicalized online. After that attack, Governor Hochul of New York issued an executive order, and among many provisions in that executive order, she mandated that New York would implement a program to use social media to intervene in the radicalization process. So we began working with New York State last year to design and stand up a program that would ensure that anyone engaging with online content that incited hate or violence within the state of New York would be offered access to free and confidential services which can de-escalate them from violence and save lives. In 1 year of operation, we have built a network of 30 service providers across New York State. These are organizations that typically provide family counseling services, domestic violence services, gang violence services, all of whom are now trained up on what to do when somebody walks in the door with a white supremacist ideology. And we have launched campaigns across the state, online campaigns to reach anyone in the state consuming hate content online and showing these ads that offer them the chance to speak to a crisis counselor, someone who can help. That counselor then works to rapidly assess risk, to de-escalate violence if needed, and to understand the drivers, what is pushing this individual to be embedded in this worldview, and to get them care. In 1 year of operation, we have offered services to someone in New York consuming hate content over 1 million times. That is a huge number, and I want to put that into context. New York State has a population of 20 million people. That's over 1 million times across the state of New York that someone was consuming hate content online and saw our ad. Over 30 individuals have reached out to access immediate support. I want to bring together some of these points just in summary. First and foremost, if there's one thing I can get all of you to walk away from this lecture with, no one is too far gone. We have to look beyond the data points when we see hate happening online and look at the people who are posting that hate. And we need to ensure that anyone who is engaging with hate content online, who's shouting at us, screaming at us, telling us that they are at risk, that they are offered the chance to speak to someone who can de-escalate them from violence and work with them in the long term to turn their lives around. But doing this work online requires investment in that offline infrastructure. And we all know that our social work services, mental health services are vastly underinvested in as a nation. So our first step when we're doing this work online is we need to invest in that offline infrastructure and then bring those services online to people that are engaging with violent content. And finally, intervening, stopping someone who is hateful online. It is not a hope or a dream, it's a reality, and we just need to get there first. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much to chew on. For those of you who would like to ask a question, the slide is now up. I won't scold you for looking at your phone. If you would like to ask us a question, it will come up on our iPad here. I wanted to start, you talked about talking about the problem and talking about the solution, and I guess I want to start with some of the bad news, maybe thinking about the problem. We are moving into an election year that creates all kinds of dynamics that I'm sure you're very familiar with. As your organization, what are you really looking for? What are you worried about? What kind of violence or hate online do you expect to see being driven as we get closer to November and the election?
It's a really important question. Can you all hear me with the microphone? Great. It's an important question, and it is a moment where it feels a bit like a tinderbox in America, right? I mean, a very polarizing moment where it feels almost impossible to have conversations about hot-button political issues without things escalating and falling to the extremes. For us as an organization, when we look at this problem online, we're looking at it from two perspectives. One is a kind of very laser-like focus on risk of violence. So we are looking at individuals who are threatening violence against election officials, against polling stations, against really anyone who is involved in the election infrastructure. And what we do as an organization is we monitor those threats online. When it is warranted and when there is a time and place mentioned and someone looks like they're planning and have intent, we do escalate that to law enforcement. Just as concerned citizens, we have a duty to do so. I would say that happens on rare occasions. We're not escalating things to law enforcement on a daily basis. So, there are huge numbers of threats of violence online, and only a small handful of those will actually escalate into potential offline violence. But we are out there looking for that and making sure that we can pass that information on to someone who can do something about it. So that's one layer to this, is really that focus on potential for violence. But there's another layer to this, which, when I started working on violent extremism years ago, I thought I was signing up to work on these fringe niche communities. And when we set up Moonshot, I imagined we would only ever run campaigns to reach the small handfuls of individuals that were engaging in hate. As the years have gone by and as the problem has changed and evolved, we are now seeing individuals motivated by conspiracy theories that are no longer on the fringes of the internet, but have now very much entered the mainstream. And that is one of the kind of facets of this problem that worries me the most as we head into the election. So for that problem set, we take a very different approach. So our approach isn't connect people in with crisis counselors or social workers, and we couldn't do that at the scale at which conspiracy theories are spreading across the US, unfortunately. Our approach instead is, how can we build up individual resilience such that when someone encounters a conspiracy theory online, they immediately know what to think, they immediately know what questions to ask. And the way that we frame this is about online manipulation. I mentioned earlier that, unfortunately, and I wish it were not the case, debating on the facts does not seem to really have an impact at all. As satisfying as it might be to us, it usually won't change the other person's mind. So for that reason, when we are building resilience to conspiracy theories, we actually focus in on the universal human desire not to be manipulated. And we tell people, look, there are folks online who are going to try and mislead you, manipulate you to their worldview. Here are the various signs and signals that you can bear in mind and keep in mind when you are exploring the internet. And here are the questions you need to ask such that you are better prepared when you come across a manipulation tactic online. And that seems to actually work better. It seems to get people past the debates on what is true, what is false, and actually just get people to ask themselves the right questions. And I think we all need to be aware of the spread of conspiracy theories and harmful information in the run-up to the election.
All right, I want to bring the conversation to leveraging technology for social good, and particularly the use cases of the work you did with Google and Meta to help them repurpose their targeted advertising, right, to be able to reach their users who are potentially looking for harmful content online, to either be redirected to other alternative constructive messaging or to access help. I'm curious to know, based on those case studies, if there are any learnings that you picked that can be leveraged to either counter other forms of extreme harm or can be applied to other geographical regions, considering these platforms represent billions of users globally?
Really, really important question. And I spoke a lot in my talk about the work that we do that's funded by governments. But you've raised a really important point, which is what role do the tech companies have to play in this sort of approach? What can they do that goes beyond content moderation? So going back to 2015, actually very early days of Moonshot, we partnered with Google And we created a kind of innovation lab between the two organizations to try and come up with solutions, to try and understand what are the possible ways that in platform you could redirect a user towards safer content. And that was the foundation for a methodology which we released and open sourced at the time called the redirect method, which was a step-by-step guide around how you could use advertising tools to redirect individuals towards safer alternatives online. And that's publicly available. You can look it up and find that guide. Meta then decided to adopt that methodology, but they did something different, and it was unique. They instead of using advertising, they did what only they could do as a tech platform, which is they brought their engineers in, and they actually built that redirection into the platform itself. So how this works is if you are using Facebook or Instagram, and if you actively search for hate content or extremist content, white supremacy content, there will be an in-platform prompt that will come up and will say, hey, you look like you're engaging with something that could be dangerous for you. Here's some alternatives, and it connects them into an organization. So Meta has actually formed partnerships with local organizations that can provide these services to pull people out of hate. Meta's partner for doing this in the United States is Life After Hate, the organization I mentioned to you earlier. And they also have now scaled this as a result of their year one results. They scaled this to Pakistan, to Indonesia, to Australia, to a whole range of countries. I believe there's about 10 or 12 countries on the list, and that list is going to grow as they build out those partnerships year on year. Now, I don't think this gives Meta a carte blanche to walk away and say, great, we've done our job. I mean, they are one of the platforms that should hold itself the most responsible, frankly, for quite a lot of the violence that's taken place across the world, fueled by social media. But it's a starting point. And I think, to your question, your first question, which was, how can we draw from this and as we think about other forms of violence? In some ways, actually, what we're doing when we think about hate redirection in platform is actually learning from how these platforms have dealt with other forms of violence. It's now seen as the norm that suicide prevention prompts and prompts related to child exploitation in platform will come up if you attempt to engage with content that demonstrates you might be at risk. That is now the norm, as it should be, on almost every major platform. If you are engaging with content which indicates you might be contemplating suicide, there will be a prompt that says, hey, here's a helpline, we can help you. And so in some ways, we are actually drawing lessons from what is now decades-long efforts by those other violence prevention areas to redirect people towards safer services. And I think we need a lot more cross-sector learning as we build this moving forward.
I wonder if I could ask a quick follow-up question, because there's a couple questions from the audience that's asking questions a little more upstream, maybe. So you're talking about if folks are accessing that content, then they get the prompt. There's questions here about what about the algorithms that are feeding that content? I know YouTube has been widely criticized on this front. So have you been able to talk to the tech companies, hey, let us inside the black box a little bit about how people are being served this content?
It's a great question, and the answer is complicated, as you probably might have anticipated. So there is now quite substantial evidence to show that across several of the major platforms that algorithms have, in many cases, redirected individuals towards harmful content. That's been widely documented. To work with the tech companies on that issue has been a major challenge, and it's been something that we have pushed in our partnerships with every platform that we work with. Where we are actually seeing some breakthroughs is on generative AI. So the AI, the democratization of AI, the AI revolution that's happening around us. There are now a number of tools which have been released to the public, the most famous of which is ChatGPT, but there's also Pi and many others. These generative AI tools obviously create great opportunities across the world, but they also can be used for harm. And these generative AI companies are, in part because they are all competing and racing in this innovation competition, they have been releasing these tools without the proper safeguards built in. And so where we have actually been able to make some headway is in actually doing some what we call red teaming of those platforms, where we actually go in and try and get the platform to do something harmful. Once it does that, we document it, and we document it 100, however many times it takes, we'll document all of those cases, share that with the tech companies, and use that as part of the advocacy push for them to let us come in and actually work with them to design solutions. I think there is a question for us as we think about the future of these open, available technologies, generative AI technologies. What does safety look like in a Gen AI chatbot? Because content moderation doesn't work. Moderation doesn't really work in the context of a chatbot. I mean, sure, it can say, I won't give you a response to that. But actually, I want to start thinking about how some of the methodologies that I discussed earlier, this proactive de-escalation from violence, could we start to think about how those sorts of approaches could be built into the response mechanism of these generative AI tools? And to do that would involve a whole range of ethical questions that need to be addressed, legal questions that need to be addressed. But I do think that that's where we need to be headed as a community that's working on safety online.
Yeah, and just to expand on that, so as we apply these models into other, tackling other forms of harm, as we expand into other geographical regions, as technology continues to advance at a very fast pace, as Moonshot, how do you keep up with the dynamism of it all so that you can continue to be, effective in a sustainable way?
Great question. And I'm going to say one point of context and then answer your question. So again, it has been very well documented, and I believe your research might touch on some of this. It's been very well documented that most tech platforms, in their efforts to build more safety in the platform, have done a mediocre job in some cases, sometimes better than mediocre job, in English language. But when it comes to other global languages, let alone other scripts, the platforms are really lacking in both in their content moderation and also in their safety efforts. So for us as an organization, when we were setting up with a global remit, it was very important to us that we weren't just looking at this from the perspective of English language or Europe and North America, but we were really thinking about how these solutions could apply globally. And that same methodology that I talked you through earlier, we have actually tested in Albania, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, in very, very different parts of the world. And without fail, in every place we have tested it, it works. And in contexts where mental health services are not necessarily institutionalized and supported, in contexts where there's high levels of stigma against mental health, against access to mental health care, we still find that the general approach of offering these behavioral health interventions with people who are engaging with, in other parts of the world, we might be looking at Salafi jihadism, we might be looking at Buddhist violent extremism. We did a project in Sri Lanka focused on that. In all of those cases, that behavioral health method where you go in and get at the underlying emotions works. So for us, there's then a follow-on question around the funding and how you build up the kind of institutional funding to deploy these methodologies in parts of the world like that. And that's something that we're still very much working on. We have done some programs that were funded by USAID, by the US Department of State in various parts of the world. But I think that there is a real need to invest in those parts of the world and what safety by design looks like in those contexts.
I wanted to follow up on this question of getting people help. You talked about how with school shootings, we know there's warning signs. We can always see those in retrospect. And there's really some heartbreaking stories about a mom that was looking for help or a friend that didn't know where to go. And so, we're helping them find that online, or Moonshot's helping them find that online. But even just for people in our audience, who maybe don't want to call the police because they don't want to criminalize things, but what are some of the ways when people see these kind of behaviors offline that they can start to think about getting their friends, their relatives, their family members help?
Yeah, really important point. What I didn't mention in my presentation is that the very same methodology that we use to reach people who are engaging with hate content, we also use to reach out to concerned loved ones. So, people who are searching on Google for what to do about my son who is watching this awful content online, people who are going onto Reddit and Quora and engaging in conversations about what to do about a family member they're concerned about, we also run ads for those individuals. Now, the service that they're offered is not a de-escalation from violence service. It's a recognition that a lot of people don't want to call See Something, Say Something or a law enforcement run helpline, in part because there's a long history of frankly, abuse and bad practice on behalf of law enforcement, especially when it comes to marginalized and minority communities. So there can be a breakdown of trust there, but also people don't want to risk sending their loved one away. And so there needs to be an alternative. There needs to be a middle ground between taking no action and calling the police. And that middle ground is where we also work with family counselors and social workers to offer that concerned loved one support. And the support is fundamentally about that person, not the individual that they're concerned about, but what our providers can do is help them ask the right questions so that they can understand, how serious is this? Do I actually need to call law enforcement? Because that can be a really difficult question to answer. And so I wanted to flag that same approach can apply there. But when it comes to all of you and all of us, and I was having a conversation with someone earlier about the reality that so many of us know people in our families who have been sharing conspiracy theories on family chat or getting involved in this sort of activity online. And so, yeah, the question is, what can we as just everyday person do? And I think the most important thing for everyone to remember is, if you have a loved one who is going down this path, you are the most powerful person. You are going to be the person who will have the most chance at pulling them out. Now, I say that to give people a sense of empowerment and recognition that their love for you and your love for them matters. But that doesn't mean you have to go through it alone, because that is also a huge weight to have on your shoulders when you are the one who is working to get your loved one out of this. And that's where there's a number of organizations across the country that can help with this. I already mentioned Life After Hate. They support families who are dealing with an individual going down this path. But yeah, you don't need to go through it alone.
So we're almost out of time, and maybe we could do a little speed round here. A couple of quick questions that I think are really interesting from the audience. What's the prevalence of online hate sort of per capita in the US compared to other nations? Is it a uniquely large problem here in the US?
That is a great question, and I wish I had a great piece of data to share, a figure to share. I'm going to take that question away and talk to my team about whether, the per capita, how we would quantify that compared to other countries. But I can give you my qualitative assessment. And I think, the U.S., this is not a new problem in the U.S., especially when we're talking about white supremacist, racially, ethnically motivated violent extremism. This is a centuries-long problem. We are just now getting to grips with the reality that this poses a threat to national security. And so there has been more investment in this problem in the last few years, but certainly not enough. And the US is both an exporter of this ideology abroad, so a lot of international white supremacist movements are looking at the US for inspiration, and it is also an importer of this activity. They are also, American neo-Nazi movements are looking at European movements and getting inspiration. So, where does that leave us? Well, unfortunately, what it means is this is no longer confined to the US. We are dealing with a transnational problem. It does involve international cooperation from our governments. It involves a national security infrastructure that's equipped to deal with what are actually quite fragmented and not organized into neat movements. That's the kind of dynamic that our national security infrastructure is trying to grapple with. But yeah, I wish I had some number to place the U.S. in a context. The best message I can leave you with is, we have been doing this for a long time. We have been doing hate for a long time in America. We have a big problem with it, and it's getting worse as this becomes more and more of an international phenomenon.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people in the room who are, passionate about different kinds of social problems and probably in the process of designing solutions around that, and they're curious about your business model, right? And they'd like to learn from it, so they want to know, is it a for-profit? Is it a non-profit? What's your model?
Yeah, I love this question because it's one that doesn't get asked enough, and it's actually, I could talk about this for hours. We set up as a for-profit, and that was very intentional. I came from a nonprofit background. I'd worked in nonprofits my whole life and had felt the constraints of the nonprofit funding model in funding innovation. It is really hard to get funders to give you money for something that you do not know if it's going to work at all, and you can't build the evidence base to show that it might work. So true innovation, and also tech development of technology, these are all activities that are very, very hard to get funding for in a nonprofit setting. So that was one of the first reasons why we set up as a for-profit. Second reason why we set up as a for-profit was because I had seen all too many times in a nonprofit setting when people are working on very, very difficult issues that they do not get the support and the resources that they need to look after themselves. Investing in your personnel and your staff who are engaging with hate content every day, which is what we do as an organization, it's really expensive. And again, it's very, very difficult to get the donor community to give you the sort of core funding that you truly need to support personnel to do this work. We have clinical psychologists that our team have access to. All of our staff are given the option to have therapy completely separate to the company. We don't get any information on who is taking that up. We bring psychologists in to do regular sessions with our team. We invest in welfare practices. We invest in the sorts of technology that our team need in order to protect themselves when they're doing the work online. The sorts of things that turn your screen black and white so that you don't see the colors, because that can make it a lot difficult for you. Those sorts of things. I mean, all of that, it costs money to build the sort of infrastructure to do this work in a way that is safe and that protects your staff. And we felt that a nonprofit setting would be way too challenging to be able to fund that and feel like we were doing it responsibly. And then the final reason why we set up as a for-profit was just to have the flexibility to take risks and to try new things and to be agile and to move and to pivot on the spot. And so, yeah, setting up as a for-profit was one of the best things that we've done and was one of the best decisions that we could have made. And it's given us the possibility to truly innovate in a way that I don't know if it would have been possible to do in a nonprofit setting. So yeah, if anyone wants to have conversations about purpose-driven businesses and social mission businesses, this is something I'm really passionate about. I think if the world is making money off of doing horrific things and horrible practices that happen in corporate settings, that people who do good should also be able to do that and be well paid and looked after. And so, yeah, it's a topic I'm really passionate about.
Absolutely.
So this is my final question, and I didn't know I was going to ask it, but I heard your opening and your story about how you did the ethnographic research with the white supremacist groups. And, you know, we're a School of Peace Studies here, so thinking about our students and how we're trying to infuse them with this idea of working across divides, working with individuals that you may not only just disagree with, but think very poorly of, like, if you could talk a little more about how you developed that empathy muscle, how you really sort of overcame your own disdain for these individuals to find the humanity in them, because I think that's a great message that we can bring to our students as sort of a final note.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say up front that I do not advise that anyone who's listening or in the room go out and meet with your local neo-Nazi. That's not the takeaway message from this. And frankly, if I were to be asked to do the same project again in 2024, I'm not sure I would, for lots of reasons, including that social media was not as much of a thing back then, and so social media has made this all much more complicated, and also it's, nobody should put themselves in danger. But the general point of having conversations across the divide, talking to someone who believes something very, very different from you, for me, I think the most important learning for me was to just listen, to just pause and listen and not always feel like I needed to say what I believed. And some of that is maybe the anthropologist training in me, where you're trained in participant observation and trained on ethnographic methods. You're not going in as an anthropologist to change people's minds. But for me, building up that, you mentioned that kind of muscle, like building up that muscle to be able to pause and listen even though I felt strongly about something, and to ask questions. to ask questions and not make assumptions. I think I mentioned earlier, I went into that project imagining these people are monsters, I will never understand them, and I left actually building some quite strong friendships is a tough word to say, but connections with people who held such different views from me, and who were fiercely anti-immigrant. I'm a family of immigrants, fiercely, held white nationalist beliefs, and I managed to build a relationship with some of those people, and that surprised me. And I think to go into that sort of project, you have to be open to being surprised, open to being proved wrong, and let your guard down a bit. Yeah.
I think that's just, as I said, a really great note, because beyond online environments, beyond violence, I mean, we are going in, as we've talked about, into a year where there's going to be plenty of disagreements, and those disagreements are going to escalate. So maybe all of us can think about listening and not always having to talk, and asking questions and being curious when we're in those environments. So I think that is a wonderful takeaway. So again, to all of you, thank you for coming. I have learned, I know, so much. So and help me in thanking Vidhya for a wonderful evening.